for International Development, and he was an analyst and consultant on their health and other programs for the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare, and Administration on Aging, and Office of Economic Opportunity. That's kind of an oxymoron in the government, isn't it?
It's all oxymoronic.
He's going to speak on Dr. Edward Rosenow, who was an incredible scientist, physician, and researcher from the 20s, 30s, and 40s of our decade. He was a leading researcher at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He's published over 300 articles. And Dr. Shakman is going to talk about his research and some of the fraud that was perpetrated on us by the powers to be at that time. Dr. Shakman.
Thank you, Dr. Husser. Thank you. Is this thing going?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You want me to run that for you?
Yeah, we can. I'm not going to get right into that right now, Chris. But yeah, actually, you could leave it on, and then when we need it, we can have it. I want to thank Dr. Meinig, Dr. Husser, and Dr. Rana for having me here. When I first met Dr. Rana, I was coming up from Southern California, and I started a sentence, and Dr. Rana finished the sentence, and I said, you know, Dr. Rana, I'm thinking on the way up here that the term biological dentistry, and Ed finished my sentence. I said, the term biological dentistry, and Ed said, it's an oxymoron. And I said, yeah, that's what I was thinking about. And I think studying the work of Dr. Rosenow, it becomes even more clear. But let me introduce open up this little talk with a little bit of a song. We don't have a lot of time, but this is something that I think it's very important that you as health practitioners are more aware of this than anybody. But it's something that may help us to remember what we're talking about. And it's a song that we all know, and I won't do the whole song because it's just too long, but we'll start with the beginning. It's the toe bone's connected to the foot bone's connected to the leg bone's connected to then we get all the way up to the neck bone's connected to the jawbone's connected with the tooth bone. The tooth is a bone. And that's something that is too often forgotten, but that's really what we're talking about right here. That the tooth is a bone. It's a live bone. It's a live tissue. And when we have a hole in that bone, we have an ulcer of the bone. And as it was mentioned earlier, I think Chris might have mentioned this or someone, that we still don't know how to regenerate bone. So that the nice thing, the good thing about the teeth is that we can get rid of that infected bone. We don't have to worry about regenerating it. But if we keep it in place and if we fill it with foreign substances, we still have an ulcer of the bone. And the significance of Dr. Rosenau's work is that he showed how these infections of these ulcerous bones, things that we call cavities of the teeth or root canals, and on one extreme and the other, that they are always infected, and that the organisms that grow in these infections do relate to systemic diseases. Dr. Rosenow fulfilled Koch's postulates and went even far beyond that with the organism from oral foci. One thing that Ed turned me on to a copy of a book by, where is he here? This is the Fisher book, and you may be able to get this from the American Academy of Biological Dentistry, and I recommend it very highly. It's an excellent book, and a lot of the Fisher book is about the work of Edward C. Rosenow. And Fisher actually spells it right out. He comes right out and says that once you have a cavity of the tooth, it's not just the root canals, it's just caries is an infected bone, and there is really nothing that we can do about it in terms of regenerating it. And I've talked to Dr. Meinig, George Meinig, about this as well. And this is really where the research has to go into. If you can't regenerate the bone, you just can't fill it, then you've got to take the tooth out, and somewhere down the road we're going to learn how to clone teeth, and that's going to be the solution for now until we can stop eating white flour and sugar, which cause caries. But if we're in this position here where we have these diseases, the caries, then we just have to recognize that there really is nothing. We don't have a solution to this yet, and so that we have to, the indicated course of action is to take the tooth out. At first, when I first found this out, I was very depressed for quite a while because I had had several root canals and caries. But now I've come to view it as it's a means of empowerment. We no longer have to be, gee, am I going to get prostate cancer, or am I going to get this, or am I going to get that? We can be aggressive in taking some action against, prophylactic action against these types of diseases, the epidemics that we have of these chronic diseases, because what Dr. Rosenow and his associates clearly proved is that all of these diseases pretty much are related to the diseases of the teeth. And it's the teeth first, secondarily the tonsils, thirdly the sinuses, but that Rosenow and Fisher and all, they spoke about these things as being primarily, it's the oral foci, primarily it's the teeth, secondarily the tonsils. Fisher also did mention the gut. I heard somebody mention the gut earlier, but he felt that that was definitely down the road. Now there's the work of Dr. Rosenow. Dr. Rosenow's work, I won't get into how I got into him. Maybe at some future meeting we can go into more detail. But I've traced Dr. Rosenow's work from 1902 to 1958. He's in the medical literature. Incredible. And there's about over 40 of these articles are in the Journal of American Medical Association. Some of his big supporters were Frank Billings, who was a president of the AMA, Charles Mayo, also president of the AMA, Walter Beering, who was a president of the AMA in 1934, said in the Journal of American Medical Association in 1938, he said that perhaps Rosenow's work will become the medical guide of the future. Actually, he was saying it's safe to say that Rosenow's work will become the medical guide of the future, and I think this is what we will be coming to. Just a bit of a word on Frank Billings, who was Rosenow's biggest supporter, and Rosenow did all of the bacteriological work from the early 1900s up through well, for as long as Billings was working. Billings was the president of the AMA in 1902, and he was already known as the father of American medical education by that time. And from that time up until 1915, he devoted most of his time to the study of oral focal infections, working with Rosenow, working with Charles Mayo, working with Ludwig Hechtoen. And then this culminated in Billings' Lane Lecture Series in 1915, and a book that's called Focal Infection by Frank Billings that was published in 1916. And Billings always thought this was the high of whatever else he did, this was the high point of his career. And the data that Frank Billings presented in his Lane Lecture Series was also published by Rosenow in 1915, and this data is the center of probably the biggest fraud in the history of medicine, biggest fraud in the history of science, probably the biggest fraud in the history of humanity. And we are all victims of this fraud. Before I get into that, there's one other reason why, there's two main reasons why Rosenow's work is probably ignored today. One is Rosenow was the point man on poliomyelitis for the Mayo Foundation from 1916 all the way through 1945 when he left Mayo. He was with Mayo from 1915 to 1944 and was the head of experimental bacteriology during that period. Now, you don't last at the Mayo Clinic for a year or two, let alone 3 decades, unless if you really are a pretty good scientist. And I don't know that there was ever a medical scientist that could ever come close to the work of Edward C. Rosenow. So one thing is that his work on polio, even though in 1940, like I say, he wasn't the point man, he was concentrating on the therapy of poliomyelitis. He would go in and give therapeutic vaccines. But the vaccines that he used for therapy were also used for prophylactics in the 40s and were 100% successful on the limited population that was studied. But his were all very, very careful scientific studies. He didn't have the luxury of a Salk who could go out and experiment with school children, excuse me. But and got very fortunate, and fortunately, and saved a lot of lives in doing it. But Rosenow's work was very effective, and there are some studies that he did with Rappaport that are particularly dramatic, where these kids would come into this was done in the late 40s and early 50s. These kids had come into the hospital, and their Brudzinski was positive. They were starting in the early phases of paralysis, and you knew that in a week these kids were going to be dead or paralyzed for life, and they all walked out of the hospital. So Rosenow's work with poliomyelitis needs to be revived. He also said that there was going to be this thing called post-polio syndrome. He predicted it back in the 40s. He has prescribed a type of vaccine that would be effective, that would help these people that are coming down with post-polio syndrome. Recently, I've been in touch with Edward C. Rosenow III and through his son Scott Rosenow, and things are afoot now to get these ECs were and other Rosenow relatives and interested friends that have been working with them. Bud Williamson, who was one of the last people to put together Rosenow's vaccines, who also, I spoke to him last week, and he was a very good friend of Fisher's and told some wonderful stories about Martin Fisher. Again, this is Death and Dentistry that you might be able to get through a copy through Ed Arana. So number one, it's the polio thing, and Rosenow took the hit for not getting the first vaccine out that was used for prophylactics of polio. I mean, it's kind of a strange way we reject his work because he didn't do something, but everybody thought Rosenow was going to do it. And then the second thing, though, which is probably the major one, is that the data that Rosenow presented in 1915, and I have this up here, this is Rosenow's original table that was published in the Journal of American Medical Association in do we have a date here? Yeah, in 1915. It was used in Frank Billings Lane lecture series. Now, what happened here, this, in 1928, and you've got 3 sheets here. 2 of them are in the book, and they're not really great copies, but I did want you to know that you can access these 3 pages and the handouts that are in your book on instituteofscience.com on the internet, okay? So that this is available to you, and it will be after the meeting if you misplace these papers, but I just wanted you to know that. The work of Rosenow, if we take a look at this first table here of Rosenow's. Can we hear me? Are we here? I don't know. Yeah, I'll talk loud here. If you look here under stomach ulcers with hemorrhages, on your sheet in here, you'll see a 60% figure here. Okay, and then for the various other diseases, that's when isolated, 60% of the organism taken from people with oral foci, when injected into laboratory animals, it caused stomach ulcers with hemorrhages in laboratory animals. Versus other percentages, for cholecystitis, it was 20-something%. For rheumatic fever, it was 20-something%. And we get down, yeah, thank you very much. We push this? Oh, there it is. For, here we have a 10% figure. When isolated, herpes zoster, when isolated, we have a 29%. And mumps, when isolated, we have, this is the percentage that that causes hemorrhages, 21%. For myositis, we've got a figure here of 0%. And for or 4% and 7% for endocarditis and so on. So what Rosenow showed is that it's much more, and the other point that he raises that the lesions that were caused by the organism from stomach ulcers were much more severe than those that were caused by the organism taken from people with other diseases, but he counted them as equal. And so what he showed for all of these diseases is that the specificity of the organism taken from the oral focus of a person with a disease was much more likely to cause that same disease in laboratory animals. And then subsequently, he was able to take that organism from the laboratory animals. He both did it not only both when the organism was isolated, later, and after animal passage. And for those of you who are familiar with Koch's postulates, that's part of the thing, is you cause the disease in a laboratory animal, and then you can recover the disease from the animal and cause the disease in another animal. That's fulfilling Koch's postulates. Rosenow did that, and there's more work that he did subsequently. I have another table in the book that you have that shows the results of animal experiments, about 11,000 animal experiments by a total of 30 different operators using using Rosenow's methodology. And that the second study was published at the centennial celebration for dentists in 1940. And it's just an incredible body of work. What happened here now in 1928, and you can see the second table that I passed out is by Holman, Archives of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine in 1928. And if you look at that table, and it's something's different. They're not, it doesn't look like the same numbers. And I was familiar with Rosenau's 1915 numbers, and so when I saw, and the way that I got to Holman is the importance, the significance of Holman is that this is a very important foundational piece in both the medical literature and in the dental literature. I found Holman looking, there's a popular book by somebody Chase that refers to the bicentennial 1976. In 1976, Beeson, who was the top guy in internal medicine, said Rosenau's work was disproved in 1940. And you go to that 1940 article by Ryman, and that article says Rosenau's work was disproved in 1928. So it's this 1928 article that is very key in the medical literature. So, and also in the dental literature, and we'll get into that in a second. Now, what Holman did here is that 60% here of, he took the 60% that I showed you on the earlier sheet there, multiplied that times the total number of animals. 60% of 103 is 62 or whatever. And then he added up all of these other categories here, multiplied them through for Rosenau's things, got the numbers of all of those, added them up, took the total number, divided that, and came up with a figure of how many, and it turns out that if you sum that up, that it's 15%, it's 60% of 100 versus 15% of 400. So and what Holman did is he didn't pay any attention at all to the 100 or the 400. What he was just talking about was when he multiplied that, added those up, it came out there was about 60 of the animals had got stomach ulcers that had gotten the organism from people with other diseases. This might be a little more clear now. If you go to the third sheet here, and I'm just showing you this, and you've got the table there, you can see it just doesn't look like the same table. Now the third sheet here is a comparison that shows what Holman did with Rosenau's numbers. And if you come down to
This one you want?
Yeah, that's the one. Come down here to stomach, duodenum with hemorrhages, and you see exactly what I mean. But I just wanted you to see that Rosenow didn't, here, this is Rosenau's number, 103, 60% of that got terrible stomach ulcers with hemorrhages. Rosenow didn't show the detail on this, but Holman had to add up all these things and calculate this out and multiply it through. And if you do that, you find that it was a total of 68 animals out of the 403 that had gotten injections with bacteria from other sources. 68 of those animals had stomach ulcers with hemorrhages. They weren't as bad as these, but they were there. Okay, now Holman ignored all this information, didn't pay any attention to any of this, and all he said was he showed 130 total animals. 130 total animals had gotten stomach ulcers. Of those, 68 came from animals, came from people. 62 came from people with stomach ulcers with hemorrhages. 68 came from people with other diseases, so that what Holman says is roughly a 50-50 chance that the animals that had stomach ulcers, that it came from someone with stomach ulcers or without stomach ulcers. So on that basis, he claimed that Rosenow had been disproved. And actually, he didn't show these data. All Holman showed was this data here, the 130, the 48, and the 52. And he showed just this last column here and the percentages, and did this for all of the categories of Rosenau's work, and it came out to a very complex table that is totally meaningless. This is meaningless information. It has no bearing at all to the total numbers of animals that were infected. And did this with, I calculated he would have had to do at least 400 separate calculations to put together this table. Now the significance of this table comes at the end of a 69-page article that Holman wrote that was a reassessment of the work on focal infection and was intended to basically to discredit Rosenow. And there's some earlier work that Holman did that was also aimed at Rosenow, but this is just clearly, there's nothing there. But this is the work that is cited in 1940. This is the work that is cited by all of the people in the early late 30s and 1940s. We have Blaney, Appleton, Coolidge, Grossman, all of these people who were the founders of the root canal organization and were early pioneers in modern dentistry, they all cited Holman and they started citing each other. And so that we have this totally incestuous cross-referencing here that occurred in the dental literature in the 30s, in the late 30s, 40s, up through the 50s. There was a whole edition, 1951, and in the American Dental Association Journal. Eastlick was the editor, I believe, at the time, and he had some major articles on it. And the entire issue was dedicated to this question, and virtually all of the people in there their work was dependent on Holman's work, and those that wasn't those whose work was not totally dependent on Holman for refutation of Rosenow, they were on the part that said, well, let's see, there's still something here. So it wasn't a totally negative thing. But anyway, this is the foundation now for the direction that modern dentistry has taken, and it's taken, and I've searched the literature to see if there was any reference to this manipulation. I find nothing in there. It seems to have fooled everybody. We've all been taken in by this. But the effects on not only dentistry but on medicine are quite major. I'm sorry?
You were saying there are two things. The fact that Rosenow was discredited because he didn't come with the polio vaccine. There was a secondary factor, or I thought you said a second thing, of the intent of why he was discredited, maybe, or why was this done by Holman? What was the payoff?
Well, I say the two major factors that I've been able to, best I can determine why nobody's paying attention to Rosenow's work is, number one, that he didn't come up with the recognized treatment for polio, the one that was used. But the major factor was probably this fraudulent article, because when we trace back both the dental literature and the medical literature on the subject, we inevitably come back to Holman, because this is the only real, quote, scientific refutation of Rosenow. There is no other refutation of Rosenow on the books.
But why was this done? I mean, what was the purpose behind this?
The best I can figure is Holman was a fairly well-respected bacteriologist. He was known for a broth, Holman broth. It was mentioned in Hayden's work. It was mentioned in various work. And Rosenow came up with a different type of culture medium that was actually able to bring out the pathogenic organisms. Now, if everybody used Rosenow's medium, no one was going to use Holman's medium. And if everybody referred to Rosenow's work, then Holman's work, which was somewhat different, was discredited. So that there's an earlier article by Holman where it becomes about 10 years earlier, where you could see that he was kind of gunning for Rosenow, because he was going after Rosenow's work on mutations and transmutations, but this time he went after the work specifically on elective localization. So that's just speculation. I can't figure out what else, except that he was a respected bacteriologist of his time.
Are you talking about when you say transmutations, mutations, pleomorphic forms?
Yes, this is critical to understanding Rosenow's work. His early work in 1914 was done with transmutations between pneumococcus and streptococcus. And there's some work in the current literature on this as well. The other thing is that we have the question of dissociation of bacteria into smaller filterable forms. Rosenow, his work was built on the work of Philip Hadley in, I believe it was 26 or 28. And Hadley summed up all of the work that had been done in the previous century. There was quite a bit of controversy over this in the 1800s, over whether these bacterial types are stable or whether there is variation. Some of the more recent work, like Mattman's work, if you trace Mattman's work back, and Mattman was mentioned, her work, you go back in that and you see that it builds on the work of Dean's, and you go back in the work of Dean's and you see that was based on the work of Heilman, and Heilman was an associate of Rosenow's, and they worked together on this. So that when you go back in the literature and you dig deep enough in any of these areas, you find Rosenow. scratch it, and Rosenow's down there. And so his work becomes very important for a number of reasons, and provides us a framework into which a lot of these other things starts to make some sense, and it all starts to come together. Conversely, there's the things like the concept of autoimmune disease, for example, which has been applied to a number of diseases with which Dr. Rosenow worked. Dr. Rosenow established the bacteriological cause of many of these diseases, virtually all the diseases that came to be known as autoimmune diseases. And the current literature on so-called autoimmune diseases acknowledges that there must be some exogenous cause. There's a genetic predisposition, but there's something else, and they're now coming back around to try to find out what it is, but there is recognition that there is something. And Rosenow showed using his methodology consistently, he and every other scientist that uses methodology came up with the same results. So that's one of the implications, and of course some of the other things that we've heard talked about, some of the methodologies that are being used to combat some of these diseases or the symptoms of some of these diseases. We are fighting against the symptoms of these diseases, so that in the first instance, if we can identify the cause, we want to get rid of the cause, and the cause is oral foci, and until we know how to regenerate in the mouth, regenerate the tooth bone that has become ulcerous, and we call it caries, until we can regenerate that, we must feel empowered that we know that this relates to these other diseases, and we really need to get this cleaned up. So none of the dentists that are working today have any fear of not having work to do, because there's a bunch of work to do cleaning up the mess that has been created by modern dentistry up to this point. So the job of people like Chris Husser and Michael Kiramati in Los Angeles, and some of the other gentlemen who I hear and ladies who I hear these people talk about, who are excellent operators and have been learning these cavitation procedures. We have to figure out a way to start teaching. Every dentist has to learn these procedures. There's a big job to do. We're talking 20, 30 million root canals a year are being put in people's mouths, and we're just creating more and more nests of infection. People wonder why. Why do people get cancer and then they cut it out one place and it comes back someplace else? They still have the nest. The nest is continually spilling out these organisms. So you're never going to get rid of it until you get rid of the organisms. At the same time, the vaccines that Dr. Rosenow developed, he was beat up so badly over the years that his last couple articles didn't even mention oral foci, but he has some very effective therapeutic vaccines that he did develop. And these vaccines need to be made generally available and better known, so that I know the Rosenow family is also, Chris and I have talked about this, and I've given him what information I have on collating the various recipes, so that we have the start of a good recipe for the bacteria. I spoke to Karsten Rosenow last week, who is a member of the Rosenow family, who has been studying the pneumococcus and streptococcus, and is also interested in trying to get the vaccines and perhaps a bioengineered version of the vaccines. So there is some attention focusing on this now, but the cause is, we know the cause is the teeth, the primary one. So that is something that we can start to do something about as well. And somehow the people that are now knowledgeable of cleaning out these cavitations, we have to figure out how we can get them into some teaching institutions and really start to teach people how to do this and upgrade dentistry and medicine in the process. That's the main things that I wanted to say. Oh, one thing, and I mentioned this to Dr. Husser, according to Scott Rosenow, and all of I never saw any reference to oral. There's been some reference to the use of oral hydrogen peroxide, and it's been traced back to Edward C. Rosenow. And for the record, Edward C. Rosenow never used oral hydrogen peroxide. The only reference that I found to the use of hydrogen peroxide by Dr. Rosenow, he used hydrogen in the last, when he developed what he called a thermal antibody. And Dr. Rosenau's work is based on the prior work of Linus Pauling and others in terms of the development of antibodies and the nature of antibodies and how they relate, how antibody relates to antigen. And in a nutshell, and you can see more detail on this, and I do have a couple of these articles and recipes on my webpage as well. What he did was he would take quantities of the antigen and cook it in an autoclave for 3 days. And